So passive acoustic monitoring, which is actually basically like anything else, we're just trying to eavesdrop on whales. We want to hear what they are doing, but like with all eavesdropping, we do it with the purpose that we have in mind, what we want. So we want to know, for example, where they are, when they're there, who they are. But it's going to be much harder to think about things like, why are they doing what they're doing? And for example, how are they actually vocalizing? How does the sound travel through the environment? Mike did a good job in bringing some of the stuff up. He missed one of the biggest influence on propagation, in my mind, that is very important in coastal waters, and that's the rarefaction. That's the bending of the sound waves at different layers in the water, which changes the sound speed profile over the whole vertical space, and that can have a huge impact on how these sounds propagate through the water. But the important part here is that the information that we are using, which is very important, we want to find out, we want to track them, we want to detect them and track them, we want to know where they are so that we can potentially talk about what are the impacts in that particular area. That can be done, the tracking can be done if we have, for example, more than one PAM station, more than one passive acoustic monitoring in an area, because they show up in a certain place and they may show up in another time in another place, and you can sort of make assumptions about if they move from A to B through that area. It's much easier if you have other data to corroborate that information, such as sightings. But what is important to keep in mind, if we want to use that information to mitigate impact, for example, we also need to know a couple of other things that basically they're not necessarily easily coded within the acoustic data alone. And that's, for example, Sheila Thorne and her group work quite heavily of what animals do in a certain area. Like when they are foraging, what are they actually up to when they're foraging in that area? Because that's an important part. So you can say like, well, yeah, we detected them here, but are they traveling? Are they just mostly just moving through the area? Or are they actually doing something in this area? There's a lot of places like Scott knows quite well off the west coast of San Juan Island where they actually feed. We know they're. But if you decide basically, well, we put a passive acoustic monitoring station here, and we want to see when the whales are here, and that's our only information that we're going to get. We don't know how important that area is for the whale at all. So the why whales are calling and how they're receiving sound has been always sort of my area that I have been interested in for many years now. And also there's some online like John Ford, he started this when it comes to killer whales, especially why. You wanted to find out why they're calling, and that's almost likely the most difficult question to determine. But and I'm not going to go through all the text that's on there because it doesn't really make sense. But it's important to determine is that the why actually tells you when and where they are calling, because it's the why that decides. The animal decides whether it's important for me to vocalize in a certain area. It's not us to decide, well, we're putting a recorder here, so that's what we wanted to know. No, it's what the whales are deciding. Okay, I have to be in contact with somebody. I have to find a mate. I have to socialize. I have to cooperate, and all those things are quite important that we need to actually even address to determine where we want to put passive acoustic monitoring stations in an area. These are the things that everybody or most of the people in this room know why passive acoustic monitoring is a good thing. One of them is, of course, and Mike alluded to that one in some ways as well. Sound travels in water faster than in light, so than in air. So light doesn't travel very well underwater. It only comes from the top. It dissipates very quickly into the depths, which of course was the main reason for cetaceans who basically came back to an oceanic environment some 60 million years ago to really focus on this acoustic channel to determine how can we make a living using sound quite well. And for me personally, as a researcher on acoustics of whales, I find myself sometimes thinking about the fact is there's no way in this world that I will understand how these animals are using sound. It's absolutely impossible because they have 60 million years using sound underwater. This is just literally impossible for us. But sometimes we think about that we can actually do that we can actually determine how they use sound underwater and how they make sense of it. And at least the humility should be there when we analyze those data that we cannot actually do that. So what we know about, especially most cetaceans use sound. Most toothed whales use sound as a principal means of navigation, prey location, and communication. Resident killer whales vocalize regularly. Keep that in mind because I'm coming back to that. PAM can still operate when visual detection means have become impossible or ineffective due to bad weather and sea state. And that's the main reason actually why we often use passive acoustic monitoring to track them. It's an additional tool to other means of detecting them. And we always should keep in mind that it is one tool in the toolbox. It is not the only tool that we should use. A little bit of history, because on underwater acoustics and listening to sounds and making sense of them. Basically, before the 1940s, underwater sound wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a very important area of research. And then it became quite important after that. And you probably all know why that is. It has nothing to do with cetaceans and has nothing to do with research on marine mammals, but everything to do with finding submarines and other things that happen that humans do underwater. Sound that they produce and how we can track them. So all the advantages of modern sound monitoring is part of an original effort to detect man-made sound. This on the top left, I found this picture. This was sort of in the 1920s, 1930s. That's a hydrophone. I think it's not easy to deploy and probably very hard to retrieve, I think, in some cases. And then on the right-hand side, and I have nothing to do, I have no financial interest in any of these hydrophones here on this picture. I just want to make sure that I have nothing to do with them, but it's just the sizes of these hydrophones from that to that, what happens. And John Ford, who's online, really knows these things here quite well. These are, and I actually still know them myself as well. These were the original ways of how we looked at digital signal processing in the times before 1990. This is a little box about that big, has a little cylinder on top, and you put some paper on it with a needle that burns basically spectrogram into that paper. And you could do it, you could only sort of analyze maybe 2.5 seconds, the most, sometimes maybe 3, but that's all. When I looked at that picture, I know that type of recorder. So that's one of those first little tape recorders that was portable, so you can walk around with it and record sound. And this, I worked in John Ford's lab when I first started. I worked with this machine quite extensively. That's a DSP K-elementric sonogram. It was literally about that size. And from that size, you go to that size. This is what these things look like now. So they're about that big. They can actually fit into these hydrophones. They can be processed in here. So all this made it possible that we could do those larger data sets that we have now. Because without that, we wouldn't be able to produce those large data sets. Now we think about those large data sets, that's all what we want to get. But when you really, and sorry, Oliver, I plagiarized your figure there totally. So this is will Fabio talk about that, or will you talk about that? Both of them. So I don't even touch that. So this is the classifier part, right? This is a software reanalysis program. That's what Mike actually explained is behind. This is what's behind this process. This was the biggest tool for us too when it came out in the early 1990s. It just made our life so much easier. But what is important to understand here too is most of the things that we learned, for example, about the acoustics of resonant kilowaves did not come from these large acoustic data sets. It came from data sets that we collected when we were on a boat, when we were putting a hydrophone in the water somewhere, because that's when we actually looked at the animals, see who was there, took photo IDs of them, followed their behavior. All this stuff that you see, most of it that you see here, comes from those studies, which very, very small data sets. And what we do now with the large amount of passive acoustic monitoring data sets we use, we apply that information. So we still, if you want to learn more, we still need to have those several types of information integrated in order to learn more about why these animals are using sound and how they're using sound in different areas, so that we can apply that to those large data sets, acoustic data sets, to make sense of them. This is Mike showed you a spectrogram. He showed you about this part. I think it stopped at 8 kilohertz somewhere. What is important to understand that kilowatt calls have harmonics way above there. And Mala's question was about the directionality of those higher frequencies, which is an important question in itself, because the higher frequencies, the call components in higher frequency, are usually in an acoustic environment, ambient sound environment that is quieter. So for the animals to use those higher frequencies may have an advantage for them to communicate when it's actually noisy, when you actually have a ship around. And the other part that I want to point out, there's a recent study on the clicks, which shows the click detector is a quite important tool to use as well, not just the call detector. Especially that recent paper by Liu et al. Showed that these clicks have energy peaks at much lower frequencies than we originally thought. The lowest energy peak of echolocation clicks at 12.7 kilohertz, which is quite below what we thought is. And the next one is at 18.8, something like that. And then the entire ones all the way up to about 80 to 100 kilohertz. But what is important to keep in mind is you have to take different types of information to make sense of what that potentially could mean. If you look at a killer whale foraging, and Sheila did that in the field as well quite a bit, you see them doing relatively short dives for quite some time before they're actually going down and forage and try to find a fish. They are not going down there using a high energy click at 50 kilohertz to start scanning around to find for fish. They scan when they're actually doing those shallow dives. And they're using the lower frequency components to even determine which area might be useful to go down and find something. Because that lower frequency gives them a much wider field that they can actually recognize where fish might be than the high frequency. So when we think about impact, that lower frequency might be actually much more important, because that is part of the searching component of the animal when it's actually trying to find food. Whereas when it's honing in on the 50 kilohertz or 40 to 60 kilohertz one, it already has found something. It already gets found a fish and it's trying to keep track of it. That is a very narrow beam. It sticks with that fish at that time. At this low frequency, that's where it's searching. And that's where the impact is much greater. But that you only get out when you actually look at stuff that is related to the behavior of the animal, not so much just to the acoustics itself. And the other thing is, I just want to keep you interested in these little things. I mean, I'm sure many those that have listened to southern resident kilowatts and northern resident kilowatts and other ones, they make little buzz sounds. Sometimes in the beginning of a call, of a harmonic structured call, sometimes by itself, especially southern residents use them often by itself. You know, that occurs. Keep that in mind. I get back to that one because it is probably more important than we think it is. The bad. One of the things might allude to the fact that there's usefulness in using acoustics to study them, or usefulness to use acoustics underwater, which is all true. But we also have to keep in mind that the acoustic environment that these animals are living in is highly dynamic when it comes to sound speed. When it comes, for example, when it's in areas closer to shore, depths, bathymetry, all those things affect how the sound travels in those areas. And last but really not least is temperature. Temperature has a huge impact on the sound propagation. And temperature, as we all know, it gets warmer in the summer. That also affects the upper layers of the water, the upper 20 meters. In that regard, the upper 20 meters of water column have a much, much higher sound speed than, for example, anything below. But also at the difference between the different temperature layers, the sound waves tend to bend in either way. If it comes from the bottom, it gets to be bent towards the bottom. If it comes from the top, it gets bent towards the surface. So that makes a huge difference in terms of where the animal is calling and what the temperature profile does at thinking. I'll get to, there's one picture, one graph that Swinevogel produced about sound speed variation, which demonstrates that in a moment. When we look at statistics as a whole, not just per kilowatt for a moment, the vocal rate is really, really important to consider when it comes to passive acoustic monitoring. Fin whales, of course, have this nice old song. Bowheads have that too. They sing for very long periods of time. They can be tracked that way quite well. When it comes to blue whales, also sing, but not always. And sometimes blue whales actually only make sounds for a couple of seconds every hour, but it's irregular spaced. So they're not doing it at the same time in each hour, but sometimes at the end of that hour, sometimes in the beginning, sometimes in the middle. So acoustic tracking or acoustic detection becomes very difficult if you do it for a long term. So that the species that you're interested in passive acoustic monitoring efforts are very important, what kind of system you're using. Tooth whales using higher frequency sounds and marine whales and higher frequency sounds generally travel shorter distances than lower frequency, which in itself, that like Mala was saying, the upper frequency component is potentially quite important for these animals, but it also doesn't travel as far. So echolocation clips don't travel as far. So your detection system has to be closer to the vocalizing whale in order to capture those sounds. And last but not least, as nice as it might be, and it's often used, killers don't necessarily always vocalize. We have had, Lucy had a couple of incidences that they went through active pass, which is a quite narrow waterway, and they didn't say a word. So the whole way through. They didn't talk at all. And I think boundary pass was the same. Yeah. So you have them quite often where they don't talk at all. And it could be that that is seasonally affected, that it's group size affected. So all those things come into place that we need to determine when we think about, we need to take the behavior again into account when we want to find the right location for passive acoustic monitoring stations. So here is a work that I discussed early 2018 with folks at JASCO. It's detection range modeling. Most papers that you see when it comes to killer whale call detection range use some sort of a constant, often kind of 5 kilometers around it, as sort of the typical range in which you can get the killer whale calls. And we wanted to find out as well, what is the actual range variation that, and we started out with the modeling part first, and then later on I show you, we went out and actually tested some of that in the field. What you need to know is that the variation in the source level of the call, not just the broadband source level variation, but the variation of the source level by frequency band, because that tells you how far you can actually detect a sound or not. So these are calls, all the changes over frequency. And you can see that the polynomial graph, it shows it quite well. It's good enough for the model. Let's put it that way. But the variation also becomes bigger in higher frequencies, which tells you again that potentially they're using the higher frequencies very specific for a specific purpose. What is important as well, these are data from Brianna Wright from her thesis work, I think. It's where the whales are calling within the water column. So this is sort of a profile, sort of a general, these are northern resident killer whales, sort of general profile of where they might be. And as you can see, most of the time they're spending in the upper 20 meters of water. So what that means is in the summer, most of their time is spent in that high sound speed area where warmer water is. It travels really nicely in there. It doesn't travel as well towards the bottom, and it doesn't travel as well from the bottom upwards either. But also what's the problem with that is most of the noise is also in that upper water layer. And most of the shipping noise actually travels quite well in that upper water layer as well. So that is something that you need to take into account as well. So where they're vocalizing is where also the noise is. The other part is sound propagation varies quite as well. This is Melanie Austin's work. She did radial sound propagation loss modeling work in different areas. I think what it tells you in the different colors is the loss in dB by frequency, by depth over distance. So it shows you where, for example, sound travels better underwater and where sound travels not as well. And last but not least, this is, as the model turned out to show, this is the most important influence again, which we kind of thought it was, but that's the ambient noise. the ambient noise by frequency. And the ambient noise by frequency is really the most important influence on the propagation and the detection range of these calls. This is the model output. I'm not going to go too much into it. What it just tells you is there's a high variation in terms of probability of where you can detect calls at different times of the year and with what kind of probability. And it is affected when you take, for example, 5 kilometer distance, which is here, you can get that either 40% of the time when everything is sort of in mean, the source level is mean, the noise level is mean, propagation is sort of okay. Then you get a 40% of the time you can detect that call at 5 kilometers. Whereas the same detection range at high source level, when propagation is really good or really bad, propagation is really good, then it can go up to 67, but it's never 100%. At the same time, at certain times of the year, the 5 kilometer range, the probability of getting 5 kilometer range is lower than 15% of the time. That affects, of course, how well you can detect and track your whales at that particular location. So then we went out in the field and did some testing. We have a system where we have a transducer and hydrophone, which is 1 meter apart. So we're actually measuring the source level. We can range the source level, so we can play with it. And we use calls, but as you can see, these are not the ones that we use for actual measurements, only partially, but at least we're looking at it, how they actually transmit over distance and how these sounds are affected when they are detected with the surface-based recorder that is in the upper layer at certain distances and the vessel comes from. So you can see the harmonic structures travel, the cap is by the way, that's SMIU's coastal acoustic buoy. We rented that one for that purpose. So the harmonics sort of drop off with distance quite linearly, whereas the buzz component of the calls do not. The buzz components of the calls actually travel at times much better in noise than harmonic structures. So this is to show you that effect what I told you about where in the water column you are. The bottom one, an AMA sits about 106 meter depth. The cap was at about 15 to 18 meter depths. Of course, that one is much closer because we couldn't go down with the cap because we didn't want to lose it because SMIU would have tried that position. So we did only use about 1 to 1.5 kilometers. But as you can see, from that signal sequence at 2.3 kilometers at the AMA at the bottom, this is what you will see. And again, the only thing that really comes through well enough is the buzzing sound. I'm not going to go into that one too much. Again, it's the same system. This is what Taylor developed sort of an extraction, so we can extract the magnitude of each of those bands from the source level cause, and then we take the same and then measure the received level at those bands at different distances. And then you can calculate the transmission loss between those two. This is what we actually use for measures. Not the actual chords, but these are tones that we're playing at specific frequencies and buzz and sweeps. So the tones tell us the exact source at that particular frequency, and then we can determine what the actual transmission losses at different distances. Last part, ugly, and I don't mean ugly in the terms of really never do it, but in some ways maybe it is. What we need to take into account was what I said, behavior is important. What the whales are doing where is important. But what also is important is that if we don't hear whales, and of course, all of you probably know that the absence of a whale call doesn't mean the whales are not there. It does not mean that. You know, it means that sometimes only 13% of the time, you know, in some places at a certain distance. So that's something that we need to pick and call. And if we want to track whales, we have to really be very strategic about where we place our acoustic monitoring station. And it has to be driven again by the behavior of the whales somehow, not by where we think we should place them. Not considering the good is also something that would be ugly. So that we, of course, whales may travel at times in which observer effort is low. So when we need to use that tool effectively in combination with other means, such as sightings, or as we do in some places with infrared cameras, with thermal imaging detection systems. So use it as one tool in the toolbox rather than saying rely on that one alone. And all the other stuff, it's not that, this is the important part for Ruth. Because the one thing, I want to make that point very clear. The reason why when I talked to Ruth first about the animal movement prediction part was the fact is that I was looking at ships moving at 8 to 11 knots if they are slowed down. And I'm looking at whales moving at 3 to 4 knots at times. They both are moving. They're both moving at a fair speed. So assuming that you can detect them at one place, interpret that it was the right call, oh, these are southern weathering killer whales, notify somebody who can make a decision of what to do about this, and then assume the whales are still there at that point and the ship is still there in that same relation to where they were at that time. And that is not true. And that's why we need movement forecasting for that purpose. If we want to do something in terms of mitigation in somewhat near real time. Just for, I don't know why that one is there. It's not supposed to be in here. Okay. Anyways, okay. Don't look at that one, but then you can't do that. I gotta get out of this show and quickly show you what the.
Look my slides.
No, I wanna go in there. And all right. I think I can go back. You can see it now. So this is what we're doing out there. There's one area that we see on the map where the actual sightings effort is fairly low because there's not many people out there. But the whales spending quite a bit of time there. That comes out of the work that is done by Sheila's team in the summer, for example. So that was a quite important area. We know that from the behavior of the whales. And we put a number of recorders in that area. And we also added thermal imaging cameras at the lighthouse up there. And we used the cabal, which Caitlin will talk about in a moment. So I don't touch on that one, but it gives you the direction of the calls as well, and it gives you allows you to determine when they are there. And these two,
where are those stations at? Those ones.
They are Kamana Light Station is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Yeah, and they're basically just over towards the edge of Swiftsure Bank, that slope area where we're looking at. And I just want to finish up with these are, because it was mentioned before, these are the detections of southern resident kilowatts we had out there at the time when the vessel went off San Juan Island. So you could see they spent a lot of time out there, which was good to know. At the same time, These are data from a species that doesn't talk that much. Actually, it talks, but the males only talk during certain times of the year, and then they are very loud. But these are humpback whales. And these are the detections that we get from the infrared cameras. So we can determine, basically, if we had both systems, we can determine more species at once with different systems over a much greater distance. So this is about 14, 15 kilometers out onto the water. And as you can see, we have put the AIS tracks in here for the vessel. You can see also how the humpback whales orient themselves when the ships are around. Some are not right in where they are, and some don't really care. So that's of course that's our risk. And I just want to make that part when it comes to ship collisions, we really need to think about large whales because they are really much more affected by ships like this than, for example, killer whales. Anyways.